Hello, you're listening to Don't Listen to This podcast, all about 1,001 albums to listen, not films. God, I'm in a different mindset completely. 1,001 albums to listen to before you die, or allegedly should. I'm Ewan Gleadow. I've got a nice new haircut. My hearing's back again to talk about Robert Dimery's collection of albums that you should allegedly listen to before you shuffle off the mortal coil. I am, as ever, joined by a fantastic guest. It's a genuine pleasure to introduce Jon Nickoll, who is an absolutely incredible musician, a radio host, a playlist innovator for the embassies. An absolute pleasure to have you. How are you?
Mate, I'm really good. I'm very thrilled to be here this morning talking about one of my favourite subjects.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I suppose it kind of leans into what we're about to talk about. But have you been listening to anything good recently?
Yeah, oh well, I've got quite a painful anecdote to relay. I'm you might well be aware. There's a new Beach Boys box set just come out, Sailor on Sailor. And I think we've chatted a bit before, buddy, about the Beach Boys album Surfs Up. This box set focuses on Carl and the Passions and Holland album, and I can't really afford to buy it till January.
Yeah.
So I've been kind of like haunting myself by watching YouTube unpackings of the box set. And even worse than that, I pre-ordered the box set from Amazon and then had a crisis of conscience and thought I can't justify 120 quid before Christmas with kids and blah blah. And but so that 120 quid is now stuck in pending in my bank account.
Yeah.
Oh my god! But so I've been revisiting lots of early 70s Beach Boys, which I adore that stuff.
I'm glad you brought that up because I listened to "Carry Me Home," which was one of the singles they released for it. It's amazing that they can just sit on that for decades and then think, "Oh, we'll release it now." Go for it.
There's a great quote somewhere saying that the Beach Boys have, the unreleased stuff in the Beach Boys archives is better than most bands' released stuff.
Yeah.
Which sounds ridiculous, but you can almost imagine that being true. Certainly with things like, as you say, "Carry Me Home," mind blowing, and also the Beach Boys. I think often more interesting or even better versions of albums lie in the vaults.
It's absolutely, yeah. And I mean, I suppose we're talking about just as innovative a musician today with Elvis Presley, who is kind of. I mean, I suppose I always ask this to guests when I ask them to choose an album. Is sort of people tend to lean towards albums they have memories with or experiences with. And I was just wondering what your experience is with from Elvis in Memphis.
Oh my god! Well, Elvis really is one of the defining things in my life that I saw an Elvis movie called That's the Way It Is, which was filmed in 1970 when I was about 7 years old. And without sounding too silly, it literally did change my life. I thought, well, I have to be a musician, and actually, I probably wanted to be Elvis, which is difficult when you're living in suburban Margate in the mid '80s, especially when you look like I do as well. But it changed my life, and so an Elvis mania started from that period, and so I would kind of hoard charity shops and cassettes in that era. And one of the first things I got was where is it? Here it is. On cassette, I had this album, which is called the Memphis Record, which is a compilation, which is pretty cool. I got this in vinyl a few years ago, but I had this on cassette, and it's like remixes, but basically it's stuff cold from the sessions that built up the From Elvis and Memphis album and a few other bits and singles, and also Back in Memphis, which was the follow-up. And so my memories of this whole period of Elvis's career are just kind of like incendiary, kind of just being mind blown and just kind of. Falling in love with an artist really, and slowly, and the beautiful thing about an artist like Elvis and like the Beach Boys as well, the kind of catalogue is so huge that, especially as a kid and in the pre-internet era, it's a mind-blowing thing because you have a crappy kind of greatest hits compilation, and it's very difficult to associate. Certain tracks sound so different. You'll get an early Elvis song, then something from this period, and it's kind of. You're trying to make sense of this stuff before there's kind of, there's discographies and things online, and it sounds like different artists.
Yeah.
And so, but anyway, I'm
No, I can prove that point that you've got there because I've got Elvis Rock's 14 golden hits behind me, and it goes from Heartbreak Hotel to Hound Dog to All Shook Up to Let Me Be Your Teddy Bear, and it's a bit of a car crash of tracks.
Yeah.
But I remember being given this when I first started collecting records by my grandparents. They were like, "Oh, we've got some in the attic," and they had 2 Elvis compilation albums. I'm like, "I'll keep them until I can get them through rough trade," and then I've just kind of stuck around with them because it's you just drop the needle on Hound Dog, lift it back up, and put it back.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's no,
Well, I mean, I've got a really good drummer friend of mine, and he pointed out that probably Hound Dog really is probably one of the first. It's basically heavy metal, isn't it?
yeah, pretty
It's
much.
still shocking. I've got a really nice Asian EP actually I found in Hong Kong years ago, and it's really scratchy. But Hound Dog still sounds freaking mind blowing after all these years.
It's
But yeah,
amazing.
1956. That's unbelievable.
I think it was, I'll do the boring insert in a minute
Yeah,
because that bit doesn't really make much difference. But I think it's amazing how Elvis's music, particularly for me, is just so. There's a legacy to it, obviously, but the amazing part is that it sounds incredible still. I think you could,
yeah,
if it released now, you could put it up there still. It really is stunning,
yeah.
and I think that is cemented with from Elvis in Memphis, and it's an interesting period for Elvis. It's an interesting time
Mm.
for his discography. It feels like the perfect blend for a lot of behind the scenes stuff as well as on record stuff, which
Yeah,
is it's
absolutely.
wonderful.
Yeah,
Um, I'll drag us through the keynotes then,
yeah.
as if they're contractually obligated to be carried out. Um, so just a few quick keynotes we've got from Elvis in Memphis, released by Elvis Presley in 1969. It had Elvis Presley on it, obviously, but the likes of Reggie Young from the Memphis Boys, Dan Penn from Spooner and the Spoons were also there as session musicians and guitarists. The genres that it's been defined by, allegedly, are blue-eyed soul, country soul, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll, which I think about summarises Elvis at this period quite nicely. So I'm going to have a nice sip of my machine-made coffee, and I'll crack through this insert.
I'm regretting. I've got a grotesque novelty mug that an auntie bought for me. I would never deliberately. I hope people don't think I'm deliberately sitting here with a mug that has guitars on it. Shit. Let me hide it out of the screen.
I've used this mug knowing full well that it's far too big for the coffees I have, but I'm just too stubborn to buy another mug. I mean, it's pretty big. I mean, the coffee in
Yeah.
there is non-existent at this point, but far too stubborn to get anything else. I've got a nice glass of water as well, actually.
I could live without alcohol quite easily, but I definitely couldn't live without caffeine.
Yeah, you know what? I think I could go teetotal, no problem, starting tomorrow, as
Yeah.
long as I had coffee. I think I'd be fine with that.
It's weird, isn't it? Yeah, because I think caffeine kind of fuels your day, whereas alcohol is a nice end or a nice diversion throughout
Yeah.
it. But caffeine is just like it's like petrol for the car, isn't it?
It's exactly that. I was reading recently as well. It's kind of like you wake up, the first thing that you have is to have a coffee. I didn't realize you meant to kind of wait a little bit to wake yourself up so you don't have that midday crash. So I've been experimenting with how I drink the coffee at what time of day. I've just
You've been
found,
free falling for all your
yeah,
adult life. Yeah.
that's the thing. It's like I'm getting on to 23 now.
Yeah.
I'm getting on a bit. So I need that coffee boost in the afternoon. But no, I'll get us through this insert and we can start cracking on.
Mate, can I just quickly run off and grab myself a quick glass of water?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll pause the recording. I think that's resumed there. My editing skills are terrible, so if there's a good chance this will just be left in.
You'll make me look like a Roman centurion or something.
No, I think I was reading the insert. So we got after the genres, the album, all those good
Yeah.
bits. I was about to start the insert, which
Right.
we've had a recurring theme with these inserts that some of them haven't been very good.
Okay.
The Abbey Road one, I remember being particularly useless. And it's not a slight on the journalists that have written this or the reviewers.
What is the? You mean you're reading from the book now?
Yeah, but it's so essentially every album has an insert that explains the sort of the period, the time, the recording, and the release, or are
Yeah.
meant to.
Right. Okay.
This one does. I think the further into the book you go, the more clutching at straws it gets. This one's particularly good though. I think this is fine. So we'll crack on through.
Yeah.
Elvis Presley spent much of the 1960s concentrating on starring in increasingly awful films. His comeback began with a 1968 TV special in which he concentrated on the R&B numbers of his youth. Inspired by the experience, Elvis relocated to his hometown of Memphis, then a red-hot musical metropolis, issuing forth regular soul and pop hits, and booked sessions at American Sound Studios. ASS was run by top producer Chips Moman and employed a crew of legendary session musicians, among them Dan Penn, Tommy Cogbill, and Reggie Young. Elvis had not recorded in Memphis for 14 years, but the sessions with their easygoing southern humour and the warm local ambience meant he enjoyed himself immensely. Along with covers of songs Elvis wanted to record, Moman fed him songs that he, as a publisher and producer, had procured. There was soul singer Jerry Butler's recent hit Only the Strong Survive, which, just as a side note, Bruce Springsteen covered that on his new album, and it's a delightful song. I'm sure we'll talk
It's,
about
the
that.
album's called that, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah,
Yeah.
I've
Yeah.
still not picked that up because I think
No.
$30.99 for an album at this point is a little pricey. But I didn't. To
Wait,
be fair, I didn't. I've dropped my glass of water on the floor.
shit.
I didn't realize that. Oh, it's alright. It's just the coaster. You know when the water's perspired and it's kind of.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, okay, yeah, yeah.
I'll pick that up later. That's not a problem. That can stay in the edit. But Bruce Springsteen's new album, I didn't realize was a double LP because I'd had it sent to me and it's like, right, here you go. There's the MP3 files. It's like, it's very, very weird. This rather have it on my record player, but
Yeah.
yeah. Where was it? And Hank Snow's "I'm Moving On," a country gem that Elvis and the band morphed into a funky workout. In the Ghetto was procured especially for Elvis, and as the album's major hit single, would help re-establish him as a contemporary talent. Long Black Limousine features a soulful cover full of sorrow and anger, while Burt Bacharach's "Any Day Now" is a stone-cold classic ballad. Suspicious Minds, recorded at the Memphis sessions but not included on the album, returned Elvis to number one in late 1969. An America unhinged by war and assassinations wanted Elvis back as its rock icon. The Memphis sessions established his relevance again. Now, that last line, it re-establishes his legacy. I don't think that's deniable. I think that's very true. I think that is essentially what happened with the Memphis sessions, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was a chain of events. Actually that reading paints the scene pretty well. I think obviously the decade of the '60s was mired in making increasingly bizarre films, and yeah, things change. And actually, just before the TV special in '68, there was a slight. You can kind of trace back the appetite changing in Elvis a little bit. He made a gospel album, recorded it in '66, and it's released in '67 called "How Great Thou Art," which someone said I read once was like the Sergeant Pepper of gospel music, which I think is a a really really brilliant quote. It's probably slightly misleading because if you bought that album expecting to hear you know psychedelia, you'd be disappointed. But the point being that he kind of dropped out in the mid '60s of recording any non-soundtrack stuff at all. It just felt quite, I'd imagine, just quite disenchanted, disillusioned, and just apathetic. And then got a new producer called Felton Jarvis, who really kind of reinvigorated him and got his mojo back. So the How Great That Art album came out, and then on some of the soundtracks, there's some really cool bonus tracks. Elvis started beginning to revisit some R&B stuff like Big Boss Man, High Heel Sneakers. I mean, so you can see the tide turning a bit,
Yeah.
and then the TV special, of course, was a huge thing, and then these Memphis sessions in '69. Suddenly, Elvis is I mean, the extraordinary thing is that his voice changes dramatically.
Yeah.
Suddenly, you got this kind of really kind of distorted, raspy urgency, which you just don't get on the soundtrack albums. He kind of sounds quite bloated and kind of lazy and kind of weird on some of those mid '60s albums like Paradise Hawaiian Style and Harem Scarum and Frankie and Johnny. It's a bit. He sounds strange. I like it, but it's different. But then suddenly, bam! He sounds just. It's almost teenage again, and kind of there's a desperation and an urgency about it. So this thing captures him. This album from Elvis in Memphis captures him right at the peak of this really weird, unexpected resurrection.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm glad you mentioned that. It sounds almost teenage of Elvis. His voice returns essentially. It's first time recording in Memphis in 14 years. And if you go back 14 years, you're looking at the likes of my maths is not good. So 14 years.
I'm really bad at maths.
56, 57. So about the time of his debut and afterwards, which is where a lot of people fall in love with Elvis and his music. And I think it's certainly where I sort of thoroughly engaged with Elvis for the first time was I think a couple of years ago when there was lockdown and stuff. I started working through the album book, and one of the very first albums in the book after Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours is Elvis Presley's self-titled piece. And having that as a double pairing, just to listen to those back to back was an absolute pleasure, you know. To open with Blue Suede Shoes is just wonderful. And I think 14 years on, he kind of returns to that. He returns to his roots almost. He figures out what he was wanting to say as an artist, and with a collection of delightful covers. And I think, especially this year, I've sort of leaned more into listening to cover albums and stuff like that. Mainly because there are a lot out there. I mean, obviously, the most famous example beyond Elvis is probably Johnny Cash's American recordings, which are just wonderful reworkings of songs. And how lyrics can mean so much.
That's a nice parallel there,
Yeah,
isn't it? Because I mean, obviously, at that point, it was right at the end of Cash's life. But I mean, I think again, there's a similarity between these two things, that you've got an artist who almost is the victim of their success. They're so freaking huge that almost what they do becomes almost
yeah,
irrelevant. And then suddenly they get a sympathetic producer, and the stars are in the right alignment, and suddenly they can remind the world that actually there's a reason why they're Elvis Presley, there's a reason why they're Johnny Cash, because they're
yeah,
freaking brilliant. But that becomes almost an irrelevancy. These guys are so huge. And I guess probably I'm not a huge Michael Jackson fan actually, but I guess Michael Jackson devotees would probably say the same thing, that you forget why Michael Jackson is Michael Jackson. It's because they're bloody
yeah.
great,
I think it's
and that becomes yeah,
yeah. I think every artist, especially sort of the ones that have sadly passed, like Elvis, like Johnny Cash, they go through a period where it's not that they're not relevant; it's that they're no longer what the general public wants to see. It's they have
yeah,
rises and falls. It's you look at sort of modern bands just in general. They have that peak and then it's downhill, and then if they're lucky, they get that resurgence. They get that second wind. It happens to very
yeah,
few people, unfortunately. But with
yeah,
albums like from Elvis in Memphis, it's sort of a reminder that their talent. There we go. It's a reminder that their talent hasn't diminished. It's just the fact that their music is no longer what pop is. Um, and I think from Elvis in Memphis, I mean, obviously, I think generalities aside, it's a bloody good album. I think that's
yeah,
the gist of it. It's a very very good album,
yeah,
possibly Elvis's best album. Um,
yeah.
it's stunning. It's a collection of delightful covers. We mentioned a few in that
Mm.
insert there.
I love that when they mentioned that is it Hank Snow or Hank Williams that I'm moving on. I can't remember.
It is.
Yes.
I'm reading through Hank Snow.
Hank
Hank
Snow.
Snow. Yeah.
Yeah. That you're right. That I'm moving on thing is really radical, because I guess the original thing would have been a really kind of like a banjo led kind of country
Yeah.
hoedown thing, and yet, as you say, with that American Sound Studios um, staff band, this thing turns into a kind of like like almost like a Motown funk workout. And this whole album and the two albums and the singles that recorded these sessions are dripping in
Yeah.
that kind of stuff. I think Elvis is just so elated to be in this kind of musical setting, and also physically, the studios are really, really quite down at heel. I actually stood. As you know, I'm a huge Elvis fan, so I went to Memphis and I stood on the site where the studio was. It's not there anymore. It's torn
Yeah.
down in the late 80s, I think, or early 90s. It's a really kind of funky part of town. It's very, very close to Elvis's high school. So that must have been on
Yeah.
Elvis's mind. He really was physically, geographically where he grew up, which must have been kind of interesting for him. But it was a really shabby area and part of town. And given that he was kind of in Hollywood and Nashville and LA, this must have been like quite eyebrow raising for him and his entourage. I think, is this really where we
Yeah.
are right now? This is different, but loose and kind of soulful. And I think you can hear that.
Oh,
You can
definitely.
definitely
I
hear it.
think it's obviously we can't just brandish it as it's return to the roots, because there's a lot more to it than that. There's a
Yeah,
sort of rekindling of a
yeah.
passion that he'd lost through his films. But the
Mm.
bulk of Elvis from Elvis in Memphis is that this is a guy returning to his hometown. He's had a very illustrious and successful career. He's on the downward trend and has taken an active choice to fix it or try to. And it's a great success that
Yeah,
Elvis in Memphis is a success, because I think it's one of the few genuine efforts where someone has taken a step back and thought, okay, this is how I make myself relevant again. This is how I make myself a more public option. Because Elvis was a huge, huge. I mean, I the archive clips, the black and white back in the day,
mm.
the mid '50s sort of performances on live TV, they are astounding. They are brilliant, and
Yeah.
it's
They still are utterly incendiary, and it's yeah. Some of those kind of black and white things on YouTube can seem quite quaint, but they're just dazzling, aren't they? They are electrifying.
they're
It really was
amazing.
punk, you know.
And I suppose to go from doing that, and then about 12 years later, you're starring in Live a Little, Love a Little, which is
Yeah.
a bit of a change of pace.
I'm
And I
glad you
think,
mentioned that actually, because that's yeah. I am because I so adore Elvis. I do love. I'm very familiar with all 33 films, and actually I'm quite partial to that one. The only
yeah,
reason is that film is kind of from this era, so he looks incredibly cool.
yeah,
But yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that. It's quite an obscure Elvis film to mention.
it is. I think it was that and Speedway came out the
Yeah,
same year.
Well,
And
Speedway was the last regular Elvis album before.
yeah,
Speedway came out, then the TV special album, and then this album. And so Speedway again, he looks really cool. He's starting to lose a bit of weight. He's looking a bit more uh, vital again. But yeah, when you compare Speedway to kind of this album, it really is a day and night scenario. And
yeah.
Christ, it must have been thrilling for him, and thrilling for his wife, and thrilling for his friends to think, Christ, this is just we're getting back, because I think Elvis was a really intelligent, deep thinking character, and I think he was just. There's a really poignant interview from '56, just when he was we just got his movie contract with Hal Wallace, which was a thrill for him because he wanted, in his mind, he was going to be like a James Dean serious actor, like a Marlon Brando,
Yeah.
James Dean. And there's a very poignant moment where he says, somebody asked him if he'd be singing in the films, and he said, "No, I won't be singing in the films." And so you can imagine how distraught he was. I mean, he was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood,
Yeah.
but so deeply, deeply miserable about what he was doing. And so I think when this period when things start turning around, he must have just been so satisfied that he was recording stuff that he believed in again. Yeah,
Absolutely. And I think uh, on Elvis's film career, though, I think there's a slight tinge of tragedy to it in the sense that he kind of popularized the musician moves to cinema routine.
yeah,
Just a few years later, Frank Sinatra was in The Manchurian Candidate. A few decades after that, you've got David Bowie, Iggy Pop, Elvis Costello, all featuring in movies.
yeah,
And there's part of me that really does believe that if it weren't for the likes of Elvis and the early trendsetters, Gene Kelly, that sort of thing,
yeah,
there would not be this transitional period where artists go, "Oh, I'm a bit bored of my music now. I can pop into the movies and just have a
mm,
few bit parts." But for Elvis, it was a real full-on 30 plus filmography, as
yeah,
well as doing motion picture soundtracks, as well as doing recorded releases. Um, and I don't think there's what's the word for it? There's not to do that much work in 1 year, like just one calendar year. If you can do 3 albums, 3 movies, interviews, live recordings, live everything, that is a lot of work to do in 1 year. I mean, it's if we look at the year after from Elvis in Memphis, the kind of sandwich before and after,
yeah,
there was Let's Be Friends, Back in Memphis, and That's the Way It Is. There's
yeah.
3 albums there.
I
Not
mean,
to
I think
mention
there's
the
a great interview from 1972 during the Elvis on Tour movie. It's the last film, the last documentary in his lifetime.
yeah,
And they're asking him. It's really fascinating. It's on YouTube. You can find it. It's about 35 minutes long, and they're asking the usual kind of polite questions, and then they asking about the films, and Elvis just can't stop talking about it, and he just says, I never want anyone to think that I was," and that a lot of this stuff wasn't used in the film. I guess it
yeah,
wasn't to the Colonel Parker's his manager's taste. But he was saying, it must have seemed that I didn't care and that I was blasé and that I was throwing this stuff around and out. I really wasn't. I couldn't have cared more. I was physically ill with
yeah.
doing it, and I think, but he says over and over again, it was really, really hard work. And as you say, movies, for Christ's sake, 2 or 3 movies a year. I mean,
Oh
that
yeah,
really is 3 or 4 months of getting up at 6, 7 a.m. And I mean, as a musician myself, I mean, obviously, dismally unsuccessful compared to something like that. But I mean, just if I'm having a photograph taken or someone's coming to see me at a gig to maybe book me for a gig, it's on my mind for a week before. Being filmed or being photographed is really, really stressful
yeah.
because you really, really feel like you don't want to look crap. You don't want to look like an arsehole, and you want to look. You want to be. You want people think that you're reasonably good at what you do. So the pressure of being up in the morning, doing films in the increasingly changing decade of the 60s, where Dylan and the Beatles and all that stuff's going on, and you're mired doing this crap. It must have been, I mean, an absolute Herculean feat to get out of bed and just do it.
It's an imagery thing as well, isn't it? It's kind of how the public perceive you is how they're going to think of you.
Yeah,
It's why I think Johnny Cash, for instance, with the Man in Black stuff, that's such a smart move, not just because it defines his performances, but because it gives people something to cling to when he's not present on screen.
yeah.
The Man in Black, oh yeah, Johnny Cash.
It's a brand thing, isn't it?
It's a brand thing, yeah, and I think it's especially now artists have to be really protective of that brand.
Mm,
Not because it might just be an upset or it might just sort of fall apart, but because that's what's inherent to their music now. If you take
yeah,
someone like Yard Act, Wet Leg, Sam Fender, there are inherent sort of colloquialisms to their own act, to their own attires, to their outfits, to their outpouring of social media presence that is kind of similar to what Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, Bob Dylan had to do. I think the way Elvis did it obviously is quite different to what is happening now because Elvis didn't have Twitter. But in the late '60s, especially, it's like you mentioned in that '72 interview. There was a real desire for Elvis not to be not. I don't think there's a desire to be relevant again. I think there's a desire to sort of put to bed rumors that he wasn't really working hard because he absolutely was. I mean, just before from Elvis in Memphis, he had Elvis Sings Flaming Star, which is a really nice album. But as far as From Elvis in Memphis itself goes, I don't even know where to start. It is an album of just sincere quality. There is not a track on there that I couldn't listen to over and over. It's such a delightful piece, and it's very sentimental. It's very moving, and it's kind of expectedly so because this is Elvis on his comeback, and it's wonderful. It really is wonderful.
Yeah, I really there's something about music from the 20th century as well. I think particularly. I mean, you mentioned the Sinatra album in the Wee Small Hours, which is one of my favorite albums of all time as well. And I think, and this record has, I think there's something about the nature of how music was recorded in the 20th century, that the fact that almost essentially you're hearing an event because a lot of it is happening in a room at the same time. And again, at the risk of sounding kind of hackneyed and cliched, that I think that goes a long way.
It does. It does.
It's kind of, it's not a live recording. It's different from a live recording, but I think when a studio space has to be booked, it's almost like going for a soundstage and making a movie. There's a commitment. There's kind of 15 musicians turning up. There's a producer that's going to be there. You're blah blah blah. You know what time your car's going. You probably dress up quite well for it. You turn up and you do it, and there's an adrenaline about a project.
Yeah,
and I guess, with kind of doing stuff in home studios and things can bring out amazing stuff, of course, but it's a very different vibe, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, I think it's telling that, From Elvis in Memphis, which is quite common at the time, was to record an album rather quickly. So
yeah, and I think in any case, probably 2 albums and enough stuff for singles as well.
Yeah.
All in like over a couple of weeks, whatever. Yeah,
I've always been quite jealous of that workmanship, where it's the ability to do that much in that short period. Essentially sets you up for the rest of the year, but even then, you may be finished for the rest of the year. You're still doing work to prepare for the next year, and I mean, From Elvis in Memphis, recorded January to February, it was released in June, which is insane. That's 6 months. But it is mad. It is amazing. I think it's rather telling of the time as well. I mean, you look at someone like Bob Dylan, who released 2 or 3 albums a year. You look at the Beatles, who were yearly putting out something that sounded so sonically different every year. There's a real intensity to that work, and I think a lot of the albums have sort of diminished that intensity. I don't think From Elvis in Memphis has that diminished intensity. I still think it's a very
also because everyone is physically in one room.
Yes,
at the same
absolutely.
Time. It's kind of, there's not much to do, is there? You record it until you can. You can sweeten it up, overdub bits and pieces, but effectively it's all there. It's done and dusted. Whereas now, I mean, I've got stuff on my hard drive. I don't know if I can swear on this podcast.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
I've been fucking around with for 15 years, literally.
Yeah.
It's maddening and it's annoying, but there's something about the kind of we're going in, we're recording it. Well, of course it can come out in 6 months' time because it's done.
Yeah.
It's recorded. It's on tape.
Yeah. And I suppose I mean, not a reflection on what happens now, but we're seeing a little bit of a resurgence in that. I remember when the Mercury Awards were on, all the interviews that were done with the artists that had been nominated. They were asked, "Oh, what have you got in the works? What have you got upcoming albums wise?" It's like it's 6 months on from them releasing the first, and they're already said, "Oh, we've got the finished one. The second one's ready to go. We're not releasing it yet, but it's done."
Yeah,
and it's that workmanship that's coming back, and I think there's a lot of it that comes from an understanding that the spotlight isn't forever. It is not permanent. There are very rare cases where an artist will survive in that spotlight for the whole of their period as an active musician. I think the only few I can think of are Paul McCartney, Bob Dylan, Bruce Springsteen. That sort of caliber, which is, well, not once in a lifetime, 3 times in a lifetime, I suppose, for those 3. But it's such a rarity that an artist can stay relevant and also release consistent music as well. Which is as intense as it sounds, but I'm sure it's a bit more intense on the other side of it. I don't have to go into a recording studio and write up 12 tracks for a new album.
Yeah.
And I think that, to me, is one of the great benefits from Elvis in Memphis. This is procuring songs from other artists that are going to work well with Elvis's vocal range. He's got quite the range on him. He's got quite the selection of songs here.
Yeah.
A lovely standard six songs on the A side, 6 songs on the B side, which is honestly just a classic. It's lovely to have it like that. But to open with something like Wearing That Love Don't Look, and then lead it up with
It
all
sounds so urgent, doesn't it? I keep using the word urgent, but that it kicks him with that kind of Hammond organ, and
yeah,
and he bursts out, "I had to leave town for a little while," and it must have stopped people in their tracks, because it's just like, wow, that's yeah, it demands and commands attention,
yes,
and that kind of blue-eyed soul. I mean, yeah, it's just another universe from like a track from Speedway. Like, I mean, God, yeah, things like Five Sleepyheads, He's Your Uncle, Not Your Dad, just kind of Hollywood candy floss, and suddenly this thing comes out, and I always think it's kind of, there's almost a kind of Motown-y vibe on
there
on
is,
the Elvis
yes, oh definitely.
tunes, isn't it?
It's
Which is really, really thrilling, and the funky bass lines, and it's just, I don't know, I did actually put a thing on an Elvis forum that I read and very rarely write anything on, because these forums are like a minefield. You know, people just start arguing and
oh
attack each other.
yeah,
So I haven't got an appetite for that crap at all. But I did once ask a question, and I've got millions of Elvis books. And the question was, did Elvis ever meet Marvin Gaye? And there was no conclusive answer. There's no record of it that I can find. But I imagine, because Elvis in the late 60s and early 70s, Marvin Gaye in the late 60s, early 70s,
oh yeah,
obviously What's Going On and Let's Get It On. There's a kind of, there's a little bit of a synergy there.
there is, and
Obviously, Marvin Gaye didn't throw away his career like Elvis did in the '60s, but
yeah,
in terms of kind of changing his direction, in the early '70s and late '60s, and kind of rediscovering his soul a bit, that would have been a fascinating conversation between Elvis and Marvin.
oh absolutely. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
glad you brought that up as well, because it's kind of, I always find it quite difficult to remind myself that there's a vast expanse of artists, and however relevant they are at the periods they're in, it's amazing to think that in the late 60s you had the breakup of the Beatles, Elvis Presley, Bob Dylan, Johnny Cash, etc., etc., etc. It's amazing just to piece that together as one period when so much came from it. It just, I can't get my head around it. It's as intense as it sounds, and again, that urgency you mentioned, there is a real urgency on this record. I think not just from how they're playing, how they're vocalizing these covers, but from just the feeling behind the recording, the reason for recording it, the return home. It's a very detailed and deep album, and I think a lot of that does come from him heading home.
Yeah, and there's something about the stuff that was recorded in that studio too, though. But obviously, the Dusty in Memphis album, which I think is that just before this album. It's very similar.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, 69. The chemistry between the players and just the sound of the album. As you were saying, though, you do hear it's really peculiar, because you don't. I don't get tired of listening to this stuff, and you do. It's just, it's like an album, a bit like What's Going On, obviously worlds apart in some respects, but you don't get bored of the records. It's very hard to define why that would be, but you don't. There's different things to hear, and I guess essentially you're hearing, again, you're hearing an event.
Yes.
And there's always weird anomalies and chemistries and things that happen in something real that just constantly kind of regenerates, and it doesn't sound the same way twice, which is really weird, and I can't tell you why that would be, but it's a fresh thing, isn't it? It's like a classic film. It's like,
yes,
it's never quite this. Maybe it's down to where you are that day.
I was just about playing. Yeah, I think it definitely comes down to where you find yourself. I think that's one of the great things about finding new music and great albums, is that there are always those that will just sort of fuse to a certain moment in your life, and then it's sort of. I mean, for me, that album will always be Different Class by Pulp, which is essentially the record that got me through 3 years at uni. I would pop that on in the morning and just have it rattling through.
So for you to meet like Jarvis Cocker, that would be. I mean, that's such a huge thing in your life.
It is.
That's
I mean, to the point where definitely the influence of the music went further. It was sort of style choices from
Yep.
what I should read, what I should do. And it's like music has that great impact. And I think one of the great things about Elvis, for instance, is that that impact is great. I think there's an impact that, I mean, any artist can have that impact, but I think it's rather telling that From Elvis in Memphis has that universal impact. I think it's a very
Well, through playing music at the Savoy Hotel for 20 years, I've met Bacharach and I've met
oh
Paul
wow
McCartney, and they both talked about Elvis,
yeah
which is really so. Yeah, Paul McCartney wanted to talk about when he met Elvis, which is mind blowing, and then yeah, but Bacharach, we talked about the Any Day, because Elvis has a great version of Any
he
Day now
does
on
he
this
does
record, which is probably, I mean, it's the coolest, but I mean, that is the version. If anyone listening to this podcast hasn't heard Elvis singing it Any Day now, my God, it's
it's
mind blowing.
wonderful.
It's like a movie in a song.
It is, and I'm glad you mentioned that as well because Long Black Limousine has its own
Yeah,
influences there with the title
yeah,
alone.
very filmy.
Um,
Yeah,
but I'm glad you brought Burt Bacharach up because that is probably one of my favorite tracks on the album. But
yeah,
it's strange that I suppose my generation, because we grew up with Austin Powers, will you know
yeah,
Burt
yeah,
Bacharach from Austin Powers, but then it was
yeah.
the first Burt Bacharach album I actually listened to was Painted from Memory with Elvis Costello,
Mm.
which is
I
absolute.
love
It's
that record.
wonderful.
I love that
It's
record. Yeah,
beautiful.
is that in the book?
No, it's not.
Right.
There are. I mean, the long shot project thing for this is that I'm going to mark a few albums. I think I've removed 3 albums so far because
They're in the sin
yeah,
bin.
they're in the sin
Yeah,
bin. Not because they're bad per se, but because there's either a better album that represents the genre or a better album that represents the artist. And it's for
right.
Elvis Costello. There is one that I think is Brutal Youth. I just get rid of it, get
Okay.
Painted
Yeah,
in Memory on, and that'd be so much
yeah, and
better.
also there's so much again. It's a great thing for you guys to chat about
Yeah,
because yeah, you've got the meeting of two kind of worlds, haven't you, in that
it
album?
is wonderful. I mean, I always think Toledo is just a wonderful song, but
Bizarrely, that is my
yeah,
favourite song from
it's
the album.
wonderful. It's so good.
I mean, yeah, God, that's it. There's something about the sound of Elvis Costello's voice on that. It's yeah. A couple of the tracks on that album become a little bit, and I'm sure Elvis Costello, if I could ever met him, and I never ever, I'm sure he feels the same way. There are a couple of kind of like stylistic choices on the album, the way they're arranged. I think Costello must have thought are a bit
Yeah.
naff. Some of the choral sounds and some of the guitar sounds on some of the other tracks are a bit mushy
Mm.
later on in that record. But Toledo, there's 4 or 5 things on there that are just absolutely kind of cornerstone standards.
He
I
was
think.
the Elvis Costello was the first ever gig I went to.
No,
Yeah,
wow, okay, wow, yeah,
it's kind of an embarrassing story because I'd not been to a gig until I was 20, and just
yeah,
before lockdown, I went to see Elvis Costello at Sunderland Empire. It was great. It was
mm,
really good, and that's kind of
yeah,
it
yeah,
clicked something in my mind. It's like I should go to more of these gig things, and from
yeah,
there it's just capitulated. It's exploded into seeing anything I can. I've got to
yeah.
go to Bridlington next year. I don't know how to get to Bridlington, but
Who's playing
Pulp,
there?
the opening of their tour,
Oh, cool. Wow, yeah,
and then to see them at the back
man,
end.
that's gonna be. I mean, I remember seeing Brian Wilson a few times of Beach
Yeah,
Boys fame, and I guess the Pulp thing will be a kind of similar vibe where you'll have a room full of people quite pretty emotional
yeah. I mean,
because like you've got a personal story to this
it
stuff.
is, and I think it's part of me is I saw Jarvis Cocker live with his new outfit, and it was very good. Jarvis, but I
Yeah,
never thought I would see Pulp live. I think a
yeah,
lot of it, especially now that I'm looking back on music like Elvis, like Johnny Cash, it's kind of making peace with that you'll never see them live. But I've made
yeah,
peace that I'll never see Paul McCartney live. I'm very jealous of my 2 pals who went to Glastonbury and saw him live. But
yeah.
my concession is I've seen Bob Dylan live. That'll do. Instead of it's like a trade off.
Oh my god, I haven't seen Dylan. How was
He was
that?
incredible, like genuinely
Yeah,
fantastic. It was
was it quite the recent thing at the Palladium,
I
or was
went
it?
and saw him at the Bonus Arena in Hull.
Right.
But it really was stunning. Obviously, he didn't do any of the classics, but you're not there for the classics. He's a
Was he basically doing the new
yeah, Rough and
Was it
Rowdy
Rough and Rowdy?
Ways, which is stunning.
Had amazing reviews that
Yeah,
tour. Yeah.
it was really delightful. But he also did a couple of covers from New Morning. He did a bit of Blonde on Blonde. It was really
Did you get that? Did you get that thing that I got when I went to see Brian Wilson at the Festival Hall? I think in London, and you just sit there and you think, I was sitting right at the very back, literally the worst seats you could imagine. And I just, having grown up with my dad playing Beach Boys' Greatest Hits, I just couldn't freaking believe I was in the same room
Yeah.
as the guy who has that
It,
brain. And that's almost worth the price of admission
oh
alone,
yeah.
isn't it? It's like I'm in the same room as Brian Wilson. This is
I think
fucking, this is
to be in
unbelievable.
the same room as someone that hasn't not only influenced you but has influenced the entire room with their music, with their thoughts, with their
Yeah.
process, it really is stunning. It
And I think also in this strange 21st century world, I think also perhaps this is so boring to say this, and we're all getting tired of it. But also off the back of the pandemic and things, I think these genuine, real experiences um, are even more
yeah,
valid because we're increasingly in a kind of digitally, weird AI world where you can sit. I mean, I grew up where if you watched a program on TV at a certain time, and if you missed it, you would never see
yeah,
it again. Literally, obviously now that's obviously we're in a completely different universe now. But how amazing that there's still, you know, that there's still so much value to an almost supernatural degree to seeing an actual person in the flesh, and you can never, ever, ever, no matter how many crappy holograms you can see Elvis live with the shitty London Philharmonic Orchestra. Christ, avoid those albums at all costs. That means nothing compared to actually seeing Bob
yeah.
Dylan in a room. That's
It is, and
priceless.
I think it's
Or £85.
well, yeah. It was
Yeah.
that. I mean, to be fair, I think it was money well spent in the sense of I don't think I'd ever see Bob Dylan again because I don't think he'll tour again.
No.
Not in the
No.
northeast of England. But it really was intense. It really was quite wonderful. And I think a lot
Yeah.
of that comes from the presence of an artist. I think there are certain artists that no matter
Mm.
what they do will always have that presence. I do think Elvis is one of them. Obviously, when he did his
Yeah.
tours after from Elvis in Memphis, there was a change of pace to what he was perceived as. I think there was, the change in costume, the change in style. He quiffed the hair bigger and
Yeah.
bigger and bigger. Went to
Yeah.
Hawaii, like nice little gigs over there, and I think it's at the
Yeah.
core of it though.
I think this took me the period as well. That I mean, this was, I mean, this was a really interesting transition stage as well because he's quite kind of mod in this period. Obviously, it's still about 2 years before the big jumpsuits and
Yes, yeah,
stuff. He's incredibly slim. He's in great shape, and this is a very special period. Uh,
it is.
yeah,
It is
extraordinary.
extraordinary. I think that it speaks to the legacy of the album as well. I think to look at sort of the greatest albums of the '60s, it would be very easy to include from Elvis in Memphis. I think it's just
Mm.
without question one of the best albums to come out of that era, which is pretty
Yeah,
high talk considering the quality that came out not just throughout the '60s but in that year alone. You had the likes of Abbey Road. You had it was a busy time for music, and
yeah,
it really is one of the defining Elvis albums. I do truly think it's his best album. I
Mm.
adore it. It's really truly good.
yeah,
I mean, if you look at what else came out that year, sort of how music was changing to, you've got the Velvet Underground, you've got King Crimson, the likes of those were, making waves. They were starting to influence. They were starting to essentially beckon in that new stage of music. And for
yeah,
artists that kind of were steadfast in their sort of not defense of their sound, but sort of their trust in that, knowing what works for them, and making sure that they sort of ride that wave. Johnny Cash did it, Bob Dylan did it,
yeah,
etc., etc. For Elvis to release from Elvis in Memphis, which is essentially a country blues album with bits of rock and roll laced into it,
yeah,
when the likes of Hot Rats were out, Led Zeppelin was out, it
yeah,
really is quite brave to do that. You're going up against Let It Bleed.
yeah,
You're going up
totally.
against Sly and the Family Stone. Scott Forer just released. It's stunning.
Yeah, yeah,
It
mind blowing.
is. It is. But I think there's a bulk of it does come from, again, we've spoke about it, where Elvis found himself and the resurgence that it brought. How do you think that impacted the later stages, that sort of into the '60s, the last.
Actually, when I said mind blowing, I went completely blank. I just remember what I was going to say. If you look at what's really fascinating about Elvis as well, if you look at his
Hmm,
contemporaries, from the mid 50s. So you've got obviously Jerry
Yeah.
Lewis, guys like Carl Perkins, Chuck Berry. Can I think of one more? Lost them died. Eddie Cochran and Buddy Holly. Anyway, those
Yeah.
Little Richard. Those guys were really stuck basically on a 50s Americana cabaret
Yeah.
circuit. So you'd see Jerry Lewis playing in 1970, and it's going to be greatest hits. I mean, I know he had he did a kind of raw country and western vibe too, but basically those guys, from what I understand, were very very much mired and anchored in their what made them famous. It's going to be, if you see Chuck Berry, it's going to be Lucille, Johnny Be Good, blah blah blah. If you look at the track listing of when Elvis returns to Vegas, he kind of throws away his hits. Hound Dog and maybe Blue Suede Shoes and Can't Help Falling in Love. They're kind of like
Yeah.
1.5 minutes. And what Elvis is doing on stage is where he's at then. It's really, so he almost despite himself was had an artist of integrity. He just couldn't help but be himself and do what he wanted to do. So obviously Elvis was a huge, huge draw on the live stage, but people weren't getting, Elvis's greatest hits. There are millions of them. He really didn't do many of them. He did what he wanted to do there and then, which is like big Vegas ballads, a few things from this period, of course. Hardly touched anything from the Hollywood period at all. And just often did he did a great version of the George Harrison Beatles song "Something." Yeah. From Abbey Road, and so he sang what he wanted to sing, and that really is different from a lot of his contemporaries who felt like they had to do the kind of 25 things that were their greatest hits. Elvis didn't really do that. He did kind of keep moving.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it speaks a lot about his integrity as an artist that was still moving with contemporary pieces, because 9 times out of 10, if you go and see a musician that's been around for a while, the end of their show, the encore, is going to be those hits. It's going to be what you essentially paid the money to see. Elvis Costello ended it with "Pump It Up." That it was expected, but it's good that there is a balance between the hits and the contemporary works, which is essentially what the tour is for. I thought, just to link it back to Bob Dylan, he didn't play any of the hits. He didn't play Like a Rolling Stone. He didn't play Mr. Tambourine Man. There was no reason for him to do so. There was, the body of work he had in the past few years is intense. It's incredible. The same for Elvis. It's why bother delving into the past when you've got works that are here and now and relevant and current, that are prepared for the live stage. And it's,
and also he just wasn't, he didn't want to sing Hound Dog, or Blue Suede Shoes. It's like he was really into kind of big ballads, really, by the kind of mid-70s. Christ, and it's or funk, funky things like Polk Salad Annie, deep South kind of funkier stuff. But it's just very chameleon-like and very very different from, if you God, I mean, compare even when he first went back to Vegas in '69, that album, which I think it's just called, what's it called? I think it is called. I've got it here. Elvis in Person. That's right. So there's a live album. That's really interesting because that's kind of very similar. Elvis is in very similar voice to this record, of course. It's from the same year. Very similar in spirit to the Comeback TV special. So there he is doing blistering rock and roll versions of some of his early hits. He'll sing Hound Dog, and it sounds a bit like you might expect Hound Dog to sound 10 years after it's recorded. But that drops away really quickly. So in 1970, when he's back in Vegas, suddenly he's covering like Neil Diamond stuff. He's covering Creedence Clearwater Revival. He's covering Beatles. Almost anything but his own hits. It's really mind blowing, and that's really
it is. No, absolutely, it is inspiring, and I think it's part of that comes from where an artist finds themselves, but also what they see in that song. We spoke about our own connections to music. Me with Pulp, you with Elvis. The artists themselves are going to have that connection as well. It's going to remind them of a period, of a time that they may not want to revisit. And it's always the Donny Emerson is always who I'm reminded of with stuff like this, with Dreamin' Wild, where that album wasn't touched for 30 years. It didn't get a resurgence or anything. It didn't get seen by the public until a reporter, I think it was the New York Post, essentially interviewed him, asked him about it, and then it exploded from there. It's difficult to look back that far and continue performing those songs, especially if they were written at a very emotional period and they have connotations or meanings or messages that are no longer part of that life. And I think if Elvis was
Yeah.
going to rattle out Blue Suede Shoes and Hound Dog every night, he would become sort of just a shell. It wouldn't be worth seeing him because
Yeah.
it's just it's Elvis's greatest hits tour, which I think more and more we're seeing
Yeah.
artists sort of not shy away from playing the hits, but certainly looking back on their discography, going for those little rarities, those extra moments that not many people may have heard, which is always just a treat. I think there's genuinely an argument to be made for artists that play their unknown tracks being better than that of just the
Yeah.
successful ones. Because I have no doubt.
Or even like Mike Love, who's like
Yeah,
for the Beach Boys, is like kind of Mr. Greatest Hits and don't screw the formula kind of guy. Even he is now seeing the value in if you see the Beach Boys live in inverted commas, it's obviously
yeah,
Mike Love and Bruce Johnson and loads of other guys who aren't the Wilson brothers, obviously. Um, and that really is a kind of Kokomo good vibrations, I get around kind of thing. But even
yeah.
he puts deep cuts in now because there's a lot of commercial created stock. We're living in that period where people really can explore the murkier corners of catalogues, and it's as we said earlier, it's a great time to be a music
Oh,
fan.
definitely.
I
Yeah. I
think.
mean, it's the fact that I mean, it speaks to what you mentioned about sort of the how immediately we can access music and artists now is that
Mm,
it's so much easier to find their deep cuts. You don't have to go raking through
yeah,
a charity shop to find, Johnny 99 on record.
yeah,
It's great that we can just jump on and
yeah,
hear it. And it's, especially sort of now that I work from home, it's kind of, there's a lot of time to kill. There's a lot of days and hours to fill.
mm,
And to do that is just to listen to music. So I've just essentially been deep diving artists that I wouldn't have had the time to, or it's been stunning.
yeah.
And it's difficult to convince people that one of the best songs of all time is from a Roland S. Howard album in the mid-90s, but it is. Um, it really, and I think Elvis especially, the amount of soundtrack work, but beyond that, the studio work, the live albums, there is such a deep dive into his work, and I think a lot of that will stem from hearing this album. I think the legacy of this is sort of, to call it entry point sounds a bit insulting, but it is the perfect place to start because it's such a varied album. It gives you a bit of everything. It gives you his country charms. It gives you his more pop oriented focus. It gives you very reflective covers. Overall, I think it is a remarkable album. It's very unique. Um,
There's that great there's a quality to some of Elvis's most kind of intense stuff that has a very hypnotic dreamlike quality, and there's a great example of that on this record. His version of "I'll
yes,
Hold You in
yeah,
My Heart," with that, which is actually Elvis sitting down at the piano, which is usually for deep Elvis fans. If Elvis is playing piano or guitar, it's usually a kind of cosmic signal that something special is going to happen here because although he was a really he was a very able rhythm guitarist and a pretty good piano player. He felt very insecure about doing so, and after aside from the kind of early Sun stuff, he very rarely plays, but he's playing piano on that cut, and that usually means that he's really
yeah,
invested. And this song goes on for eight. I mean, it's like four and a half. I don't have my glasses on. It's about 4.5. Yeah, it's 4.5 minutes long, and it's like an old country
yeah,
weepy kind of song. And you hear the band keep on thinking they're going to stop it, and he doesn't. He just keeps going round and round and round, almost in love with the sound that his own voice is making. And it's it's those little moments being an Elvis fan that you kind of pick up, and the hairs on the back of your neck stand up because you're aware that there's something else going on here, and even the same in Elvis movies. There's very few Elvis films that don't have a little moment in them when you think,
yeah.
shit, that's Elvis. That's actually Elvis there. And that's a quality he had as an artist that, despite sometimes, um, or in spite of strange surroundings, he just steps up and something else goes on. And "I'll Hold You in My Heart" is that moment on that song, which is on this album, that is just very different. This is now sort of quite tight, quite arranged little tracks, and then suddenly you get this really freewheeling 4.5 minute jam that's
Yeah.
something different.
It's
Country
fantastic.
psychedelia
I
or something. I
suppose
don't
that
know.
answers the question I was just about
Yeah.
asked there, was kind of just to wind it down, is what's the best track on this album? Which is a very difficult question.
Well, that's definitely. I mean, that's definitely probably one of the most extraordinary performances. I mean, I probably like you and probably like everyone who listens to this and is a big music
Yeah.
fan. It changes every day. I mean, "In the Ghetto" would be the most famous performance on the album, I suppose. We've already talked about Any Day Now, which I
Yeah.
just think is a masterpiece. I do have a real leaning for True
Ooh,
Love Travels on a Gravel
yes.
Road, which is a real motorway kind of thing. But Only the Strong Survive,
It's.
though, is
I
hard
think
to beat, isn't
I've
it?
managed to whittle it down to 3, and it always changes every time I listen.
Yeah.
But it's only the
Yeah.
strong survive, gentle on my mind, and any day now. Are the
Oh, Gentle in My Mind. I mean, I remember, so as a kid again, I had that. The first time I'd heard Elvis do
oh
that was on the
yes,
cassette version of that album. And again, we keep on saying filmic and movie like, but
oh yeah,
that's like a film, Gentle in My Mind. And the amazing thing is, when you hear like someone like Dean Martin singing it or whatever, it's okay, but it's just a
yeah,
slightly elder statesman of pop singing something that's slightly trendy. But you never get that with Elvis. You don't think, oh, Elvis is jumping on a kind of on the slightly younger, long haired
yeah.
bandwagon and trying to be hip. It just works, and he invests himself in it, and it's believable. And that's I think the crux of this stuff, that it's believable. It's not like, incongruous, like, yeah, Dean Martin singing or a Frank Sinatra. I mean, I love some of those later '60s albums, but sometimes Sinatra singing like his version of
Yeah.
something or whatever, or slightly looser pop from the mid '60s Jimmy Webb stuff. It can be a bit weird, but or awkward, like an uncle dancing at a wedding. But you never get that with Elvis. It's always kind
He
of,
never
it's
feels like he's
believable.
a member of that old guard. He always feels like he's very new.
You're completely right. Man,
Yeah,
you nailed it. That's it. It always feels
yeah. It feels very.
believable.
I
Yeah,
mean, it sounds like a
fresh.
generic term, but it feels very real. But I think a lot of that comes from
Yeah,
how not desperate, but how really hardworking Elvis was at this point to go, I'm going to make another successful album.
yeah.
I suppose it's a redundant question at this point. Is there an album that should replace this one on the
Hmm.
list?
What you mean? Well, I think. I mean, I love the follow up. The next Memphis album,
Yeah,
Back in Memphis, I think is equally good. Which is extraordinary because that was kind of cold from things that the producer and Elvis thought weren't quite so obviously great. But that's awesome because again, it's just Elvis with this house band with that voice. So that blow. There's some great
yeah,
things on Back in Memphis. I mean, Stranger in My Own Hometown is exquisite. You'll Think of Me is mind-boggling. Yeah. So anything from this period, I like. I mean, Elvis isn't really regarded as an album artist, of course, but I mean, Back in Memphis, I think, is
yeah.
put
It is.
in
Yeah,
the book as
it's
already, isn't it? That's a very very different Elvis, but compelling in different ways. So there's a few albums that I think are as
yeah. I
essential
mean,
as this
there'll
one,
always be
but
space to add more because
yeah,
what I've found is I'm
yeah,
replacing albums, but I don't quite have a suitable replacement ready for it. So I'm just recommending something at the time.
yeah,
Um, I think I took a
yeah,
Nirvana album off, and I've
yeah. I love you. I
just
love
get
you and
rid
your
of it. They've got
cults. It's
3 on
brilliant.
there already. You don't need MTV
Yeah,
Unplugged and 2 of their albums. Just hack and slash.
Dear
It's
Kurt,
I mean, the
I'll take
whole
you.
point of me
Yeah,
starting this project was I was genuinely shocked at what was missing from the book, and the
yeah,
sort of even the artists that are on there. I don't have anything against CeeLo Green, but whether or not he's made one of the defining albums of our generation, I'm not too sure on.
yeah,
But
sure.
a lot of it comes from there are
Yeah,
artists on there that rightly so are on there, but the albums that they've chosen are just strange. You know, Bob Dylan's a great example.
yeah,
They've got his early period. There's no Oh Mercy. There's no. I mean, one of the recordings is a bootleg tape, which is a pretty good choice, but it's telling that Desire isn't on
yeah.
there. The
Yeah, it's interesting with these things. They're all period pieces, and sometimes I'm trying to think of what example I'm trying to. That's right. When you see a movie, it's very
yeah,
interesting to look at the time it was made, because that tells you as much about the period it was. It's been made in as the film itself. And the same with these kind of compilations and these lists. It's kind of kind of these kind of
yeah.
swaves of thought come and go, don't they? So there's a period where the Dylan the so-called religious albums that Dylan made in the
Yeah.
late '70s, I suppose, like Saved and
Shot of Love.
I can't think of the one's called.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they were really really maligned and really slagged off, and now people are actually saying, actually they're really great, and very
oh
similar with Van
yes,
Morrison as well. There's kind of the '80s stuff where he got a bit kind of mind, body, spirit, and new age. People were saying, in the
yeah,
'80s, were saying we're an embarrassment. Now they're actually no, they're freaking great. So there'll be things that are really bizarre in this book. I'm sure that now we
I
would
mean, it's to be quite
consider
honest. I mean, if we
completely.
take Dylan as an example, I would genuinely put "Good as I've Been to You" in there because it's such a
Yes,
beautiful
yeah, I love
set
that
of
record. Yeah,
again covers of traditional songs, and it really focuses in on
yeah,
not a period but a part of Dylan that isn't expressed in his other albums, which is essentially his quality as a guitarist, and it's just not found in any of the other albums that are on
yeah,
the list. So I've made it my mission to just sort this out.
yeah. Also, I wonder that also, the I think it's a trio now of albums of kind of American
Yes,
songbook
yeah,
stuff that he's brought out. Um, they're they're kind of they're a bit of an anomaly now, and they're kind of politely ignored. But I mean, the fact
yeah.
is, his vocals are
It's
amazing on them. They're extraordinarily, almost embarrassingly good. And I mean, we all grew up, we've all learned to say that Dylan is a disastrous live singer. But no more I've seen clips of him singing live recently,
yeah.
which are really impressive. But also, those one of those albums will be regarded as really interesting in 15 years' time. But I guess we're just too close to it right now
Yeah, I think
to really
that's
get an
one of the
overview. But
not to go too far from Elvis, but the more recent editions
yeah,
of the albums on this list, I think, are very
Hmm.
knee jerk. They're very yeah, shit, that's from this period. Get it on there.
We're
Yeah,
going to put a
and
new one
it's
in, kind of
there are
thing.
certain
Yeah,
choices where they've kind of
yeah,
I mean LCD Sound System's new album is on there, whether or not it's their
yeah,
best work. I mean they've got albums on that list already. There are some slights that have just sort of they've not mentioned the original, they've not mentioned the debut album, but they have put American Dream on. One of the many examples of sort of musicians being represented but not correctly. It's it's a strange one.
yeah. Sure. Yeah, yeah. And it might well be the guy just wasn't so
Yeah,
familiar
I
with
mean it's a
certain
collection. I
genres,
think
but
of about
you.
100 journalists have come together and said this is the definitive thousand.
Oh, okay,
But
right,
it's I'd make the
right.
case for so many albums that aren't on there. Half of Nick Cave's discography, Bob Dylan's triplicate, these sort of albums that need to just be included.
Yeah,
I'm too
totally.
far
Yeah,
into this
yeah.
project now to realize that I should just do an alternative 1001 albums list rather than hacking and slashing my way through someone's
Yeah.
very lengthy body of
Maybe you
work.
will. Yeah,
I've spent over a decade doing this,
yeah,
but it's too late now. This is like episode 13. That's
yeah.
it. That's it now. But no,
You're in too deep,
perfect.
buddy.
It's that about
Yeah.
wraps it up. Have you got any sort of social media presence
Oh,
you want to
great.
plug? I've managed to learn how to do like a rolling wheel at the bottom where it'll put your social media, which is great.
Yeah. I've got a little. What? Probably the only thing well, I've got an Instagram page and I've got a podcast called the Imaginary Records Shop.
Yes,
So, shall I
absolutely. I'll
send you a
stick
link
that
to
in
that
the
on
description of
Spotify?
all this. Yeah.
I mean, if I got one more listener to that would double my audience. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'll send you a
perfect.
link to
Okay,
that
brilliant.
podcast.
I think
Yeah.
that's all from us.